Hello, and welcome to Where Are We Now, a captivating new podcast project from Theatre Alberta that lies in the realm between curiosity and conversations and delves deep into the heart of our artistic community here in Alberta. Together with my co-host Simone, we will sit down with artists from across Alberta and ask them the question, where are we now? So join us for light conversations that will delve into not only their path and their journey into theater, but also ask the question of where are we now as a community? My name is Andrés Moreno, and my pronouns are they, them, or ella for those of you who speak Spanish. And I'm joined by my co-host, Simone. Hi, Simone.
Hey, so I'm Simone Medina Polo. I am the Communications and Marketing Coordinator at Theatre Alberta. My pronouns are she, her. Ella, if you speak Spanish. And yeah, we're very excited to take on this. It started originally as like written essays. Now we're venturing into the world of podcasts.
Simone, do you want to tell us just before we start, just a little bit more for those who don't know about the essays?
Yeah, I'll tell you what I know. I know that it started as a project by David Van Vel, bringing just the different artists and producers and whatnot from the theater arts into giving a snapshot, I guess, about the community conversations happening at any one point in Alberta. The aim of it has always been to just give people a voice or opportunity to explore, or give us a sense of why they do the work that they do, or what kind of issues or like topics or what is presently in their mind. So when we ask the question, where are we now? Well, that's kind of what it means. Like, where are we in terms of like the community conversations, in terms of the state of the art, culture, or cultures? What does that look like for people?
Thanks, pal. Now, as our first guest, we have the one and only Kodie Rollan down from Mokinsis, colonially known as Calgary. Hi, Kodie.
Hi, Andrés.
How's it
Hi,
going?
Simone.
Hey.
Good. How are you?
Good. Would you like to introduce yourself, pal, and just let the folks know a little bit about you and what led you to working in theater?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Kodie Rollan. I use he, him pronouns and siya for any of my Tagalog speaking friends. Tagalog is one of the major languages of the Philippines, so that's the pronoun I use, siya. I am the artistic director of Chromatic Theater. I'm also a playwright. I'm a dramaturg. I'm a producer. I act sometimes. I'm a lyricist. I'm basically like a hat rack. So I wear many different hats in the theater. And I'm also currently the associate dramaturg at the Banff Playwright Lab. So that's a lot of things that I do.
Thank you for that. And now, can you tell us a little bit about what led you to being a theater artist and wanting to tell stories?
For sure. So growing up, I didn't necessarily think that theater was a viable job, mainly because it's something that my parents never really encouraged me to do professionally. They definitely encouraged my creative side, but growing up in a racialized household, specifically an immigrant household, I immigrated from the Philippines in 2005 when I was turning 11. So there was a lot of responsibility to, make it in Canada financially, right? So that I could live a financially stable life. So theater wasn't necessarily an quote unquote option for me. That said, I was always really interested in saving the world. I love superheroes. So I've always wanted to do something to help folks out and save the world. When I got into university, I thought it was going to be in political science, specifically in charity and nonprofit work. And then I took a drama course where I was like, oh, I'm going to do this theater course for fun. Everything else is so serious. I need a fun job, or a fun course rather. And then my professor really put me on to the power of stories. They talked about the transformative power that storytelling has, and immediately I was hooked and I was inspired. So that led me to a trajectory in theater. Actually, my professor is originally from Alberta. So shout out to Graham Rennick, who is a theater artist who is living in Alberta. And then the last thing I say, I know this is like quite long-winded, but one thing in my theater journey is that when I was in school, I saw everyone else in my cohort being these great artists who have been practicing theater since they were in elementary school, high school. They did all the camps. And I never thought I would be good enough to make it in theater. So I was trying to figure out where I fit. And I was decently good at business, quote unquote business. I had somewhat of a business sensibility. So I got my master's. And so I thought, okay, I'll work in nonprofit theater offices. That way I can still be close to the art. And actually, what brought me to Alberta is I sent my resume out Canada-wide, and Alberta Theater Projects took me as their development coordinator, so working in the fundraising department. And I had never been to Alberta. And then I moved, fell in love with the theater scene in Calgary, and then I met incredible artists, especially Jenna Rogers, who I want to shout out, because Jenna showed me just what I can do and really believed in me. And it's because of these artists and other mentors like Jenna Rogers, Gina Puntel, Mark Hopkins. These folks really believed in the work that I could do and gave me the confidence to go, you know what? I'm going to leave the office and I'm going to try to do it. But yeah, that's what essentially led to my practice. And I've been really, really lucky to have been practicing for a while now and to be the artistic director of Chromatic Theater.
Thank you. That was a beautiful segue because I was going to say, can you tell us a little bit about Chromatic Theater for those of us who might not know?
So Chromatic Theater was started by Jenna Rogers at around 2013, and we incorporated as a nonprofit at around 2016. Jenna started this company out of a need that she saw to have more racialized representation on stage and working behind the scenes. So when I talk about racialized, for those folks who might not have heard that term, I'm specifically referring to Indigenous, Black, and people of color and those communities. But I like using the term racialized, so I will be using that moving forward. Jenna started this company to answer a need for more racialized representation, and that's basically our ethos, is to really reflect the diversity that we see throughout not just our city, but the province and the country, but really located here in Mohkinstsis, Treaty 7 territory, colonially known as Calgary. When I came on board as the artistic associate. Jenna asked me to hop on board basically to learn about artistic management and artistic leadership. Again, Jenna invested in me. She saw something in me that made her go, yeah, I want this human on my team. And I owe so much to her for that. I'm going to talk about Jenna a lot like this. Like, I truly revere the work that she does. And I think that's something that I'm trying to, in my position right now, carry forward. This is why when I talk about the work of Chromatic, I usually say that Chromatic Theater invests in racialized voices and racialized artists and produces work by racialized artists for racialized communities. The for racialized communities for me is the most important aspect. I think that many racialized communities within the context and scope of traditional Western theater, they haven't necessarily been invited to large houses. And that's not to say that large houses haven't tried, but that's to say that there are barriers that exist participation that we know about, especially as racialized folks, right? And my work in Chromatic Theater, I like to view myself as an artistic director, as a host. So I want to host and build spaces for racialized communities where they can really see their stories on stage. So that's one faction of what I do as an artistic director. And then the other faction, that's the less fun faction. Less fun for some folks, but I'm a big nerd, so I personally don't mind it. It feels like running a small business, right? So a lot of times when people ask me, oh, what do you do as an artistic director? Or family asks me, because I don't have any family who's in theater specifically, or even in the arts nonprofit. So a lot of them, especially those still living in the Philippines, they don't know what I do. So when they hear artistic director, they're like, oh, do you direct all of the shows? And I say, no, I'm not really a director. So I tell folks a lot of times, it's like running a small business, right?
I love this way you explained it because, yeah, running small non-for-profit theater companies, anything that goes wrong is your job.
Yeah, I mean, even with this last production, there are things or moments where we've had to pivot original plans, and it feels very reminiscent of what it's like to run a small business.
I am loving the segues you're giving me because I was about to... Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about this last production that you're working on, Kisapmata. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it? Also tell us how it's going.
Yeah, I'm super happy to talk about Kisapmata. Kisapmata is written by Bianca Miranda, who's an absolutely incredible Filipinx artist here in Mohkinstsis. It's a queer Filipinx love story between two women, one of which was born and raised in Calgary, and the other is an intern here in Calgary. So she's from the Philippines, she lives there, and she's here temporarily. And honestly, it is just a raw story about their love, the beginnings of it, the middles of it, and its eventual ending. And that's not a spoiler alert because we find out in the first scene that they didn't end up together.
I was about to say.
Mild spoiler. I think what makes the show so special is growing up in the Philippines, we watched teleseries, which is very reminiscent to soap operas, telenovelas. And Bianca talks about watching those shows with her mom and her grandmother. And just, even though you know what's going to happen, you're just so invested in the character stories. And I think Bianca wrote a beautiful piece that truly embodies that. I call this piece Kisapmata by Bianca Miranda. I'm going to say the title in full to plug it. Kisapmata by Bianca Miranda. It's a love letter to culture. She puts in so many things that you can relate to as part of the Philippine diaspora. And if you were a guest in the space and you're not Filipino and you're watching the show, you are watching a beautiful love story. You are watching our culture unfold. You are watching us eat our foods, talk about our foods, talk about our homes, our family situation, the streets that many of us immigrants walked on and lived on. So it's still beautiful for those folks who are not Filipino who are witnessing it, who might feel alienated if they come in. They're like, well, I'm not Filipino. What is it for me? Gina Puntel, our director, always says it's in the specificities that makes it universal. You get to watch this beautiful love story unfold between these two Philippine women. And then for the Filipinos in the audience, you're watching our culture on stage, which doesn't always happen. It's happening a lot more. There's a lot of projects across Canada where we're starting to see that, but specifically in Mohkinstsis, Calgary, for a large theater, a well-known theater, Lunchbox Theater, who we're co-producing the show with, for them to put this up for their audiences, for us to be working together to put the show up on a larger space, it is very special. It is very special being able to see something that I didn't get to see growing up. Part of the reason why I never thought that I would make it as an artist is because I didn't see anyone that looks like me on stage. The age-old tale, right? Like a lot of us racialized artists are like, when was the first time you saw someone that looked like you on stage? Well, this is a beautiful show where a lot of folks from the Filipino community are able to see our stories on stage. And I love that so much about this piece. But yeah, I wanted to program something that felt like a love letter to culture for my first show. So now to talk about its development, its journey, Bianca pitched this show to us when she applied for our playwright unit. Chromatic has three major programs. The first one is a production. The second one is our YYC Theater Stats, where we do publications on racialized representation in Mohkinstsis, Calgary for theater productions. And the third one is our playwrights unit, where we invest in racialized playwrights. And the thing that makes our playwrights unit so special is that you don't need to have been a playwright ever to apply. And we have accepted folks who this is their first play. So Bianca applied in 2021. What makes this so funny is that when she applied, she was like, I have two ideas. I don't know which one to go with. And we were like, follow your heart. Which one do you want to write? And she chose Kisapmata. And then she went to Lunchbox Theater for their development units, stage 1 and stage 2 programs. And then after stage 2, Bronwyn Steinberg, the artistic director of Lunchbox, and I got together and we were like, we should program the show. So that's been the journey of this piece. It's been 3 years in the making. And yeah, just following it from its seed idea when Bianca came to me and was like, oh, there's this song, Kisapmata by River Maya, that I'm super inspired by and I want to write a whole play about it, to now being on stage and seeing it in its fullness and seeing how audiences are receiving it is probably the most rewarding thing I've ever done in my theater career.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what Brown at Night is, and also what was the motivation for putting together this idea for your audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I was super inspired by the work of Theater Pass Marai and Obsidian Theater in Toronto. So they had events called Blackout Night. specifically for Black audiences for some of the shows that they've had that centered around the Black diaspora there. And I remember reading about it and seeing things about it and going, what a beautiful way to bring community together, specifically, again, communities that have been traditionally excluded from colonial Western theater structures. Chromatic Theater is one of the very few theater companies that specifically focus on racialized voices. I would say right now we are one of two receiving operating funding. So our place in the community, I feel, is really important. So part of the impetus of doing a brownout night version of that is, we spoke with members of Obsidian Theater specifically to talk about what does it look like to build this community space. We also asked for permission because we didn't want to just go, oh, that's a cool thing, let's co-opt it and do something similar. So we wanted to make sure that the spirit of it translates and lives within, and also honoring the folks who did it before us. And they gave us some really great advice on just like practical things, right? Like, what does messaging look like? And they did give us some sort of approval of like, yeah, it's totally cool if you folks do your own thing. So I'm feeling really blessed that we got that. The impetus for doing it is just this idea of like, let's bring the racialized community into the theater space and bring the community together. Because that for me is the most important thing, right? For me, like the reason why I do what I do is because I want to bring communities together and talk about our stories, talk about stories that resonate with my community and specifically the racialized community. I feel so indebted to, again, artists like Gina Punto, Jenna Rogers, who I've seen galvanize community in such beautiful ways that I feel like it's a way for me to honor their belief in me. It's a way for me to carry out the work of shared values. And so for Brownout Night, the thought was just, this is a show, Kisapmata by Bianca Miranda is a show that centers Filipino voices, the Philippine diaspora. Let's invite as many Philippine community members as we can. And not just invite them to see the show and then say bye, but have an event afterwards where they can share space, hang out, talk about the show, and celebrate it. And for me, the celebration of it needed to feel like a celebration that is true to that community. So I modeled it like all of the Filipino family parties that I've been part of. So there was lots of food and there was karaoke. Not to say that so Brown and Night is something that I will continue for future productions, but I think again the spirit of it is letting that community lead. We talked to Cesar Chala and Marichu Antonio to talk about the event, asked for their advice of like, oh, if we were doing this, like, how does that make sense with what we're trying to do? And they were very generous in sharing it and doing outreach for us and giving me advice. And so when we do this again in the future for other productions, the goal is to have community partnerships that allows for that community to lead what a celebration looks like. It's not an extra marketing campaign to get butts in seats, but it's really like, how do we root the art in the community? How do we get the community involved? How do we have mutual investment as a theater company that's rooted in this land to the communities of this land? And that's why Brownout Night is so, so important to me. It's, first of all, correcting something that I feel is an injustice within the art sector, which is traditionally excluding certain communities. Mm-hmm. And also, it allows for bringing the community together and sharing space with the art and then with each other. That's truly the vibe that I want to be creating with Chromatic. How do we really root our work with the communities who we're beholden to serve? We are a nonprofit. We get public funding. So for me, there's no point in getting public funding if we are not serving the communities who we say we're supposed to serve. And that for me is like what I hold down as the biggest responsibility as an artistic director. The public has given us their money. These communities, through their taxes, have given us the opportunity to exist, to work, to create. We have to give back. And giving back in our way looks like honoring our artistic practice, honoring our values to communities, and ensuring that the work that we do is relevant to the communities that we serve, and then providing a space for them to actively engage with it however they choose to.
That's such a beautiful way of putting it. And I saw some photos and it looked like such a party. It looked like the best time ever.
It was such a good time.
I was going to ask you, like, how was it? How did it go?
It was probably the best night I've experienced in a theater space in a very long time. Like I said, we modeled this thing after a lot of things, right? So the actual impetus of Brown Out Night was modeled by work from Obsidian and Peter Passmarais, but also there was a production of The Waltz by Mary Beth Badian in Toronto that like they had a karaoke party afterwards, and they did the same thing for Prison Dancer in Edmonton, Miskichi Waskayagan, and they did the same thing at the National Arts Center when they opened. I was very lucky that I had a framework from other Filipino artists doing a big celebration of like, okay, well, what does this look like? Because when you're doing it in a family party, it's so organic, right? Tradition is there. It lives in your body. So every tradition culturally within your body tells you what you're supposed to do. When you're trying to formalize that into a colonial capitalist space, there's some logistics that need to happen. So I'm just very lucky that we had some sort of framework with these other events across the country. So from a logistics side, it was great because it didn't feel like I was starting from scratch. Most folks came in. They had incredible food that was catered by Lola's Filipino Kitchen here in Moquintas, Calgary. So that was another thing I wanted to do. I wanted to invest in a local business because I don't think theater exists in isolation. We are part of an ecosystem. So everything needed to feel rooted to community. And everyone just had a really good time. There was just so much joy, especially in the karaoke. One of the funniest parts of the night was someone organized a karaoke train to Listen by Beyonce, where like they would queue up and then after every line they would pass the mic to the person behind them. And it was ridiculous. It was ridiculous. But the feedback that I got, community leaders who were like, this was such a beautiful night, you know, and the artists who came after the show or after their performance, they came and hung out with audience members. Like, seeing them just hang out with the folks who were in the audience felt so special. They had such a great time. And overall the vibe was perfect. And maybe I'm biased. Maybe I'm still seeing the stars over my eyes of how beautiful that night was. But when I think about what a community space like surrounding the theater looks like, that for me is what it feels like. So how did it go? It went really well. And there's lessons to be learned from a logistic sense, from like a community partnership sense that like I'm taking with me.
Now, leading us to a question that I kind of want to toss at you, Kodie, and especially like, you know, dealing with everything that the world is going on, things are starting to kind of shift into a, what I like to call a new normal, quote unquote. All of this trajectory has me questioning, and part of the reason why we wanted to have these conversations with artists who are in the community is because we want to ask, where do you think we stand as a community? And not to, you know, do the thing that everyone loves, but I'm going to say the title. Where are we now? So, like, where do you think we are in Alberta? I know.
I mean, I've been saying the title of Chromatic Show all the time, right? The plugin.
Sorry, what's the show
by
again?
Bianca Miranda.
Yeah.
Kisapmata by Bianca Miranda. I love a good title drop. I think this is a very interesting question because there's a lot of different ways we can look at it. So Chromatic Theater does a program called YYC Theater Stats. It's a publication that we have that we release where we report on racialized statistics on stage and behind the scenes. So we do cast and creative teams. And we've been doing this since about 2018. And then recently, with the support of Calgary Arts Development, we were able to hire a statistician. And what we asked the statistician to do was to take the data that we have and create some sort of analysis around that, to look at trends that's been happening within the city and see if they can make sense of the data that we've been collecting. Part of the reason why we asked for a statistician or that we hired one was because we, as theater artists, we live in the community, right? So we have biases. So we hired a statistician who didn't work in the theater to see specifically like, okay, if we had an outside eye look at the data that we've been collecting, what's out there? What are the trends? And it's really interesting when we look at the where we stand as a community. 2018, 2019, racialized representation was quite low. 2020, 2021, it was quite high. There was a lot of equity based initiatives, like the 3550 was a huge thing that advocated for theater companies to have more racialized representation. So we really saw that spike up in 2020, 2021. But what's really interesting is that 22 and 23, we're seeing quite a dip again. So trends wise, we're trending back to where we were in 2018, 2019. So that, like, where we are as a community is really interesting when you look at it from that sense. Where are we as a community? I think we're fractured. I think there's a lot of fractures in our community. I know there's folks who have problems with the 3550 initiative and folks who have complained about losing work because of increased focus on casting racialized works. I feel like we're fractured in the sense of like we're still trying to find ways to connect with each other after the pandemic. I think we're fractured in the sense of like yes, there are a lot of racialized artists, or a lot more racialized artists arguably being hired, but also I'm always curious about how folks are being treated in the room. What happens when you're a racialized artist in a space that has been predominantly white, and then you have to do a lot of the labor of education and advocating for needs? I think there's some thoughts about like wishing we can go back to just why can't we just do art and all that stuff? We have to think about all of these other big world factors. But I think part of that is also our theater sector. And I don't think this is just Alberta, but it is something that happens here is we think about scarcity a lot, right? The pandemic had us thinking about scarcity and the fact that like the Alberta government hasn't increased their arts funding forever makes it hard to live as an artist. And it makes it hard for us to connect with each other because we're looking out for our basic needs. We're looking out for our individual needs. What's going to happen to me? And for me, that's a bit of a shame because I get curious about, well, how do we think about abundance? How do we frame things in abundance? How can we work with each other and for each other? I don't know the answer to that. But I think that our world has asked us to blame each other. It's asked us to blame things like equity initiatives that is actually here to correct traditionally marginalized groups, folks who have been underrepresented, whose stories have rarely been told. We're asked to blame them. And I'm curious about the ways that we can really gather as a community and be together and celebrate each other, right? If we're thinking about abundance, if there was a space for all of us, that includes productions that are all white, that have a more traditional, quote unquote, traditional base, right? But I think the problem is that we don't have that. So I think as a community, we can look for opportunities to share with each other. We can look for opportunities to be more compassionate towards each other. And for those folks who are wanting a return to traditional forms of theater, I think we can have that, but it has to mean that we open up the space for everyone first. You know, like if in a season a theater company produces a classic, I get excited when I also see them produce a show like Kisapmata, which, for a lot of theater companies, they count that as a risk because they don't know who the audience could be. There's opportunities for everyone. And I think if we can look at it in that way, I get curious about how we can better connect with each other.
It's very interesting what you're saying because when you pointed out as a question like, oh, this is a financial risk to go to this community that you don't see as like, oh, this is like our secure audience we can rely on, because theater has often been portrayed as just a strictly like white traditional sort of thing. And it's interesting also in the context of like, yeah, we're struggling for all these various different resources in a situation where we have artificial scarcity being developed, which generates artificial conflicts that don't actually address the root of the issue being the lack of funding and the lack of support for all these different stories to be told.
Yeah. One thing that I find really interesting, like, is Louise Casemore, shout out Louise, did a study with Alberta Playwrights Network talking about like some of the issues that playwrights go through, right? And a lot of them talk about the development abyss, which is, they'll get into a playwrights unit, they'll get some sort of development opportunity, they'll get a grant, and then they'll get to develop the show a bunch. but they very rarely get to then like put the show up. And one of the things that I really admire about that I've heard about like the work in Amiskitchi Waskagan is that you folks have like not only do you have the Fringe, which is like a large opportunity for folks to put up their work, but there's also programs like Riser. There's opportunities for artists to work in partnerships and get paid for their work, which I think is practically non-existent in Calgary. You know, like you can get a grant from CADA, a grant from Canada Council, and then you can maybe put up a show. Our Fringe, we have our Fringe, and we have the Ignite Festival for emerging artists. But then I'm curious about the spaces for like other works, right? Because if there's a show that feels like a risk, and a theater company won't program that, if we had more opportunities for individual artists to produce their shows on any sort of scale, then I think that creates a space for everybody. So yeah, I think where we are, like, I don't think I answered your question. Where are we as a community? I think, we need to find a way to be with each other and talk things out and gather. I think we need spaces like brownout night, but not brownout night because that's very specific. But we need spaces where we can just like gather and party and talk to each other. And there's so many beautiful opportunities if we work together as opposed to being siloed. Like theater organizations tend to silo themselves. And I don't think that's on purpose. I think that comes with the billions of things that they need to do. Like I know as an artistic director, I have 12 billion things that I always have to do on my to-do list. But you know, like being able to carve out capacity and being able to carve out time to relate to each other, to talk to each other, and really be a community with each other rather than just saying we are a community, I think is an opportunity that we need to take advantage of if we want to not just survive but thrive as a sector. I talked a lot. I'm so sorry.
Honestly,
I soapboxed for a bit.
that's literally why we have you here, pal. And I was actually just going to say, like, I love this image that you started off with the idea that we're fractured. I had this image of like we all have a broken plate and we're all fractured and we're trying to fix our plates when we haven't noticed that if we work together we can make a platter. Like I don't know, this image
Yeah.
I love what, as you were talking, like this idea that like we need to start communicating with each other because that'll also lessen the scarcity mindset that is causing all of us to be burnt out, right?
Yeah, I'm also inspired by the words and work of Adrienne Marie Brown, who talks about burnout within activism, right? And like for me, it's fractal. How do we move from fractured to fractal?
Mm.
So fractal being like spores in mushrooms, where it's like, yeah, we have our own pockets, but how do we, if we break off, how do we spore in this area? How do we spore in this area? At what points do we then re-intersect with each other? But then it's okay if we drift away, right? Like I think we have a lot that we can learn from the land. How can we do that within our communities? If we drift apart, where it doesn't feel like, oh, they are now on that island all alone, and I am no longer part of that, but rather, how do we spore in our communities and then come back together? And then knowing that if we do separate a bit, that's okay. And I don't think any of this is possible until we learn how to take accountability as well.
Mm.
You know, like again, Chromatic has been very lucky to have been part of a few abolitionist workshops with incredible artists, like specifically shouting out the work of Empoy Mogale, who splits their time between Amiskitchi Waskaegan and Mokinsis, and Nikki Shafula out of Takaranto, who like taught me, who always make me think about what it means to be accountable to each other. And I think that accountability piece is missing because I also think that and it's not just theater specific, but I feel like folks don't know how to apologize.
Mm.
You know, like the prison industrial complex teaches us that when we do something wrong, we are going to get canceled. We're going to get shoved away to be in isolation. Um, and that makes us not want to take accountability. And this, I think,
Yeah.
holds true in things like partnerships, right? When we think about organizational partnerships, how do we create means and methods so we can hold each other accountable and be like, hey, there's something that you did that caused harm, and I want to talk about it. I think the generosity of that to be able to know that I am someone that they trusted enough to talk about how I caused harm and find ways to mend our relationship allows our community to be stronger, not weaker.
Mm.
And I think that like the defensiveness that as humans we've been taught and conditioned to not to take accountability is I think, what keeps us in fracture as opposed to fractal.
Yeah, like I see a couple of major takeaways here. Like, we're not looking to be just like networking. We're looking for a community. When we are just a network, well, we have no social bonds or ties with each other. There's no sense of responsibility. You just burn the bridge and move on because everyone is just like an expendable business partner. It can be replaced very easily. And then on the other hand, you have this question like, well, now if we're onto the project of making a community, well, how do we sustain ourselves? How do we make sure that we have something to fight for? Right, like those are the things that like get easily burned out, and part of the reason why we struggle with have communities because we're too burned out to come see each other in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My big hot take too is like, if this makes it on air, incredible. My big hot take is I'm also curious about like what has led to our nonprofit theater sector to believe that we need to be producing X amount of shows in order to be legitimate. I know part of that is financial. I know part of that is this capitalist mindset. And I think there's many times that I feel like the nonprofit structure is just too beholden to capitalism. But what if, like what if we produce less? And I'm a big hypocrite because I'm constantly burned out and I feel like I'm doing 12 million things. But I also feel beholden to like having to pay my bills, right? Having to sustain things like operating funding, right? To sustain things like having to find different funding sources in order to feel like the programs that we do, we can sustain, right? Again, soapboxing.
Soapbox anytime you want, pal. Seriously. I'm going to leave us on those words because I think that that's a great way to leave us and leave folks thinking. Again, Kodie, thank you so much for jumping on. Before we go, though, I'm wondering if you'd like to plug your show one more time. I believe it was called Kisapmata by Bianca Miranda.
Yes, it is called Kisapmata by Bianca Miranda. It runs at the Vertigo Studio space until February 18th. So there's still time, there's still tickets. Go get it. It's a good show, y'all. It is a really good show. So come see it.
Yeah.
And if you see me, say hi.
Yeah, please go see the show. Seriously, if I could make my way down to Mokinsis, I would. But if you are out there, if you're in Mokinsis and you're like, what should I be doing this weekend? Valentine's Day weekend, y'all, Kisapmata by Bianca Miranda. That's the way to go. Thank you all for listening. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Here Alberta's Where We Now podcast is produced with the operating support we receive from Alberta Foundation for the Arts, the Edmonton Arts Council, and Calgary Arts Development. We're grateful for the support. Theatre Alberta is proud to work in and serve members across Alberta in Treaty 6, 7, and 8 territories, as well as Treaty 4 and 10, and all regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta.